What started as a peaceful protest on Capitol Hill ended with a mob breaking into the Capitol building itself, and bloodshed. 4 protesters died, one of them shot by police within the Capitol building itself, and shockingly, the mob itself turned murderous, killing an officer that day. Brian Sicknick was his name. And although the number of protesters who went on that criminal rampage was small compared to the hundreds of thousands of peaceful protesters gathered in Washington, the images of a mob bursting into the very center of the US government have been cemented as the final images of Trump's presidency. What a disaster, by every measure. This is the story of my visit to Washington, D.C. for Rebel News. Our motto is telling the other side of the story, and that is what I set out to do. We follow the facts wherever they lead, and I certainly didn't expect them to lead here.
Push forward! Come on!
What happened at the Capitol will change how we live our lives forever, not just Americans, but Canadians too, everywhere around the world, just like how 9/11 changed how we could use an airport. The reaction to the mob at the Capitol has already changed how we can use the internet, how we can engage in democracy, who we're allowed to speak to, hear from, and when that's permissible. One definition of terrorism is using violence or the threat of violence to affect political change. And enough protesters met that definition to give the left a crisis that it will certainly never let go to waste. The day started out relatively normally. I was speaking with individuals headed towards the Ellipse, the public park just south of the White House, to go listen to President Donald Trump speak. The mood of the people I encountered was passionate, but it was peaceful.
I guess the thing is it's not so much what Trump says as what happens.
Amen, brother.
We
Yeah,
hope
exactly.
that the results of this election are fair and are accurate. And if they are fair and accurate, Trump will undoubtedly be the winner. We just have to count on our senators and our congressmen and women to stand up and do the right thing, which I'm not sure they will, but I'm hoping and praying they do.
Great. Trump was fighting till the end. It was the day that Congress was going to accept the results of the election. Trump gave a fighting speech, but he told protesters to be peaceful.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
And it was peaceful, largely, for 99.99% of the protesters. But when you have close to 1 million people marching, 99.99% isn't enough. After the president wrapped up his remarks, the rally started heading eastbound towards the Capitol. And that is when things got out of hand. Washington, D.C. can be the most secure place in America, especially 20 years after 9/11. But for some reason, that day, the D.C. police seemed unprepared for a march of hundreds of thousands of people, even though it had been planned for weeks. In some videos posted to social media, there were only 1 or 2 officers standing in front of a crowd of thousands. How could the mayor of D.C., who controls the Metropolitan Police Department, be so unprepared? Or did she think simply, as many of us do, that it's the left that is violent, not conservatives?
They didn't have to lift the finger because we're not Antifa.
Right.
Yeah,
There's
for
no
sure.
police here.
They
at
know
all.
who they're dealing with. And I tell you what, I wouldn't be surprised if they got some agent provocateurs in this crowd.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure.
Agent
to do
provocateurs. Make
This
the Trump
crowd
guys
is-
look bad.
Let me tell you what it was like in the heart of Washington that day. The internet went down. Whether it was simply overloaded by hundreds of thousands of people using their phones, or whether it was the police that shut down cellular service, at a certain point it just became impossible to know what was happening beyond your field of vision. I stood on the perimeter of the Capitol precinct while the crowd walked up the steps of the Capitol building. And what was happening was unclear until I called my colleagues, actually, to ask what was going on. That's when I saw 2 men being carted out on makeshift stretchers.
What happened there?
Well, me and my partner right here, I'm a paramedic, he's an EMT, and all we saw was just this gentleman who was climbing up the stairs, tried to get around the barricade, cops are right there, fell over the side, landed both of his feet flat on the ground. Looks like he snapped them, possibly hurt his back.
For the 99.99% who were massed on the lawn, we still didn't know what was happening, but we could tell something had changed. Was there a scuffle with Antifa, with the DC police? Here's one of the things I didn't see until much later.
We need to not have the confrontation with the police. They're going to make that the story.
This is right-wing firebrand Alex Jones desperately trying to get people to move away from the Capitol itself. The crowd rightfully booed the men clad in black who were shattering the windows of the Capitol. But then they went in, almost unopposed. To this day, I don't understand how such a ridiculous collection of rabble could push their way into the chamber of the Congress itself. It turned into a deadly day, and with Trump having lost all of his court challenges to the election, and with the decisive defeat in Georgia state runoffs, it was the last straw for much of the establishment, who hung the mob around Trump's neck. As images of the riot spread, Trump recorded a short video telling his supporters to peacefully comply with police and to go home.
I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace.
Bizarrely, that video was taken down by Twitter, which soon banned him completely. Within days, almost every tech company had deplatformed the President of the United States. Several of his cabinet and staff had resigned, and there was talk in Congress of impeaching him, even though he is days away from ending his term. The media and the Democrats are venting 4 years of rage now that he's lost his power. By some measures, the mob on Capitol Hill was small compared to Democratic Party street gangs over the past few years. Rioters for Black Lives Matter and Antifa set Washington, D.C. ablaze, a practice they spread across America. From Portland to Seattle to Minneapolis and Atlanta, New York, dozens of American cities burned with the tacit support of the Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, including AOC, and including Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Speaking of Harris, she asked her followers to donate money to bail out these rioters. The media was even more enthusiastic of the rioters. Violence is the calling card of the left. Whether it was the shooting of Steve Scalise or the assault on Rand Paul. But the rules are different for Republicans, and Democrats never let a crisis go to waste. The mob at the Capitol was a tragedy, and it was a crime, and it was a disgrace to the party that calls itself the party of law and order, and backing the blue. But I fear that, however bad it was, it is already being used to destroy our civil liberties in ways unthinkable, even a few weeks ago. Tech companies that donated millions to Black Lives Matter are now using the Capitol incident to deplatform conservatives en masse. Not the individuals who were in the mob, but anyone who simply doesn't share their point of view. The few conservative-friendly social media companies, like Parler, a competitor to Twitter, were immediately deplatformed by other tech companies on which it relied. Everything from their web servers to their payment processors. This isn't about a mob on Capitol Hill anymore. It's about a great purge, a great reset, if you will, as every political enemy of the Democrats falls, one by one. And by the looks of it, Canadian Liberals are hoping their conservative opponents will be censored or jailed too. They even named us. Some Liberals think that they can get away with banning us now. Social media apps are just the beginning. What happens if banks ban conservatives? What happens if grocery stores start banning conservatives? What happens if you're banned from taking out a mortgage, from renting an apartment, from flying on a plane? If the official people say your politics incite violence, your whole life could be canceled. We are on a slippery slope. Some Democrats have compared this mob to 9/11. It's an absurd comparison, but it's accurate in one respect. It will be used as a pretext to demonize the new government's political opponents and as a justification for censorship and even criminalization of dissent. I went to Washington to report on the transition of power from Trump to Biden. I didn't know I was going to be covering a riot and the beginning of the end of our civil liberties. Thank you so much for tuning into our coverage here at Rebel News. We strive every day to share the other side of the story with you. If you go to rebelwashington.com, you can see all of my reports from D.C. If you want to pitch in to help us out so that we can continue covering the costs of stories just like this, please consider pitching in.